everyone. Welcome to this episode of In the Workplace. My name is April Yue, and I am a research editor at the Institute for Public Relations Organizational Communication Research Center. Today, I have the great pleasure to invite Dr. Grace Ji to share her insights on leadership communication in the context of CEO activism. Dr. Ji is an assistant professor in the College of Communication at Boston University. Her research interests include social media-based stakeholder engagement, corporate social responsibility, and advocacy and entrepreneurial communication. I really appreciate you being here today, Grace.
Hi, April. Thanks for having me. It's really my honor to chat about my research and then have this talk with people at IPR.
Wonderful. So Grace, you and Dr. Cheng Hong have recently published a super interesting article on CEO activism. So just to give our viewers a little bit more context, this paper examined how transparent leadership communication can make a social impact by engaging employees in advocacy. I want to kick off our conversation by asking, so in your study, how did you define transparent leadership communication? What is transparent leadership communication?
Yeah, of course. So we actually adopted this concept of transparent leadership communication from the organizational communication perspective. So back in 2009, Rawlings defined this, coined this concept of organizational transparency. And then it is a deliberate attempt to make all legally releasable information available to stakeholders. So those type of information could be either possible or negative, but by releasing them to stakeholders, this process can actually help stakeholders to reason their ability and then to hold organizations accountable for their actions and policies and also practices. So in the past, in the leadership and CEO communication literature, this organizational transparency has actually been, contextualized and also been borrowed into conceptualized transparent leadership as well. And then specifically in our study, because our study is situated in CEO activism, so we borrowed the CEO leadership transparency communication when they're advocating for specific social cause or social political issues. And then specifically, we adopted the 3 dimensions to look at the participation, accountability, and also sustainability of CEO activism, CEO communication, and transparent communication in their activism. So when it goes to participation, so we conceptualize that a company CEO delivers advocacy messages with their participatory transparency. They should collect the feedback from their employees and provide detailed information regarding their stance. And then the CEOs should have the necessary information to make informed decisions when they're responding to CEOs' advocacy or stance-taking messages. So that's participation. And the second dimension is accountability. So again, apply that to CEO activism. We theorize accountability as CEO provides both sides of the story and is open to criticism, especially to those employees who may have hold an opposite opinion or different stance as what CEO has to a given issue. And this is particularly important in the context of CEO activism because as we know, many of the issues you activate for can be controversial. So not everyone will be on the same page or on the same stance as what the CEO stands for. And then lastly, it's sustainability, which is about providing truthful, sustainable, and useful information for relevant parties. So again, in CEO activism, communication with substantial transparency signifies that CEOs provides timely, reliable, and complete relevant information regarding the focal issue, instead of they just merely claiming subjective feelings or stance or opinions on a given issue. Yeah, so that's how we, use transparent communication in our city.
Well, thank you. That's such a good explanation. And I definitely know that a lot of previous studies has used transparent communication on an organizational level, So it's really intriguing that this study contextualized the transparent communication in the leadership level.
Thank you.
So I think one premise of the study is that employees will be affected by CEO activism, and they will likely react positively to transparent leadership communication. So my next question has two parts in it. First, could you tell us a little bit about CEO activism? I know this is not an entirely unfamiliar concept for many of our reviewers, but how did you define it? How did you understand or define CEO activism in this study?
Yeah, so we actually didn't develop the definition of CEO activism by ourselves. We adopted this pre-existing literature, had been, written in a research examined by Chatterjee and TOEFL. So they talked about CEO activism is basically that those chief executive officers intentionally take public stance on social, political, and environmental topics. Those topics are actually unrelated to their company's bottom lines. And then when the CEOs advocate for those issues, they do not have any evidence, pretense of raising profits for their companies. So we basically follow the same definition as how we operationalize CEO activism in our study as well. And then the reason that we wanted to look into CEO activism, actually, it's also part of it. It's also because we have, as you mentioned, in the recent, social activism and our social trends, we have seen many CEOs have stand out and advocate for some issues that are pressing and concern to the American society. So some of the examples, a couple of years ago, when President Trump, posed this Muslim travel ban, there was actually more than 100 of CEOs in the United States. They stand out and they wrote a letter, wanted to overturn this legislation ban. And then more recently, like last year, actually, many Asian American CEOs in the United States also gathered together, wanted to battle this anti-Asian hate and crime that's happening since, this has been like thriving since, not thriving, but since it has been rising since the COVID bursted out. And then, so all those activities, so like social trends actually have also prompted us to look into this not completely new, but have been widely practiced CEO activism communication activities. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much for that explanation and examples. So in your study, you also looked at employee activism engagement as an outcome. So what specific employee behaviors or behavioral intentions did you investigate in this study?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we actually looked into two types of engagement. Intentions, I would say, because we asked them if they would like to do something, how likely they would like to do something in the future. So definitely behavior intentions. So we put them into two baskets. One is communicative engagement intention, and the other is behavioral activism intention. So for the communicative engagement intention, we basically asked the employees, so who came to our study, we asked them, for the information, because we asked them first, like what type of activism engagement their CEOs been up to, and then how likely they would chat or have conversations with their friends and colleagues or in the future regarding those issues if someone else brought it up or if someone asked questions, etc. And then for behavior engagement intentions, we asked them how likely they would physically be part of those social movements, for example, for donating monies for those campaigns, or join activism groups, or even volunteer for those groups, or join rallies or protests, etc. So we Actually, we think the way how we operationalize employee engagement is quite different from what we have seen in the literature. And we actually follow the interpretivist approach to conceptualize engagement or employee engagement in general, because we notice that in the literature, when we talk about employee engagement, many times those engagement outcomes are quite company centric. So usually we would measure, what's the morale, if the morale of the employee internal culture will be increased, or if we could create a positive culture, or what about employee intention rate, etc. Rather, in our study, we're looking, as you mentioned in the beginning, we're really interested in if CEOs and employees can be the social movement agents that can translate then this internal communication activities to the communities, external communities for the general social goods. So that's also why we ask those information sharing and also behavior, activism, behavior, engagement, intention questions to measure employee engagement.
Right, that's great. Now I think it's a good time to dive into some of the findings. So first of all, did you find any positive effects of CEOs' transparent communication? How did it affect employees' activism, engagement, intention?
Yeah, so the results is quite interesting because we actually did not find any direct link, no matter it's positive or negative. So there was no direct association between transparent communication, CEO transparent communication, on the two engagement outcomes that I just mentioned. Yet we actually did find indirect links. So we need an extra stretch, extra step to make transparent communication work, which is through psychological enhancement. And then specifically in this study, we looked at employees' psychological needs.
Right. So since you mentioned that employee psychological needs seems to be a key factor here affecting the impact of leaders' transparent communication on employees' activism, engagement, intention. Could you tell us a little bit more about what is the psychological needs and what constitutes employee psychological needs?
Yeah, of course. So the employee psychological needs, basically, again, is also borrowed from a very classical theory, which is called self-determination theory. And then the psychological need satisfaction is a fundamental construct in this self-determination theory. So which basically talks about human beings in general, all of us have this basic needs for autonomy, competence, and also relatedness. So there are three parts consists here, it's contributing to the general psychological need satisfaction. And then in particular, the need for autonomy is the need to obtain a sense of ownership of our behavior. So it is, our willingness to fulfill an assignment without being forced by a request. Right. And then the need for competence, which is the second psychological need, is satisfied when we are provided with resources and we feel capable of developing new skills and accomplishing activities and goals. And finally, the last psychological need is related with relatedness or connectivity. So when it is fulfilled when we feel connected with and cared by or for by others. So and specifically, in the psychological needs literature, previously, some other researchers have looked at psychological needs, again, in the internal communication field, but the outcome often, again, it's company centric. So looking at if, the job fulfillment or the competitiveness of employees could be increased when their basic psychological needs are fulfilled. But also there are some other researchers have been using psychological needs in the literature in the studies related with CSR, internal CSR, or like, for example, cost-related marketing. So when employees or consumers, their psychological needs are enhanced, they are more likely to participate in the pro-social activities and campaigns. For example, like commit to long-term contributions to companies' pro-social programs, or more likely to purchase products when the brand or company is involved in a cause-related marketing campaigns. So following that trend and following that inspiration, we also decided to look at how psychological needs fulfillment among employees can enhance their likelihood of engaging in pro-social activities that's being triggered or brought up by CEO activism.
Right. Thank you so much for that really good explanation on psychological needs. And I can definitely see how this whole process of like how the effective leadership's communication can and should go through a psychological process in order to exert its impact on employees' behavior or behavioral intention. So the takeaway lesson here, if I understand correctly, is that transparent leadership communication in the context of activism would contribute to first psychological needs satisfaction for employees. Yeah. And when that is fulfilled, when employees sense that they have the power, resource, or relevance to make a difference in the issue being advocated for, they're more likely to engage in activism.
Absolutely, yes.
Great. So here comes to an interesting part. Suppose I am a communication counselor to my CEO. What key insights should I take from your study, and what concrete actions can I take so that employees from my company will, react positively to CEO activism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in general, there are 3 takeaways that CEOs can do based on the results that we provided from the empirical findings. So first of all, I think our study highlighted that CEOs are no longer just the decision makers, opinion leaders within an organization, within their companies. They are also opinion leaders, so the call for action for social change leaders in the society. So it's very important for them to proactively develop effective communication skills and utilize mass communication and social media channels to convey a balanced, motivating, and relatable story when they're advocating for political, social, and environmental issues. And then as for those message developing strategies, we suggested that again, we focus a lot on the transparent communication part, right? So how can they actually execute the transparent communication in their message design? I think one thing is they need to showcase their employees that the impact of CEO activism by providing reports and also by providing deliverable, useful, tangible metrics or beneficiary testimonials regularly on a regular basis. And also they needed to provide data-backed and story-based reports that can be employed by contributed via internal channels, distributed by internal channels to communicate about ongoing activism programs. And therefore they can increase leadership communication transparency and accountability among employees. So that's from the message design perspective. And then secondly, because our city underscored the importance of boosting and enhancing employee psychological needs. So when CEOs are communicating about their stance publicly, they should also think about how they can better enhance employee psychological needs when executing their activism programs. So one of the findings that we have throughout the study is, there are 3 different psychological needs, right? And among the 3 of them, actually, relatedness has been the most consistent and also the one has the highest impact across all the 3 different psychological needs. So we suggest that CEO activism messages to employees should highlight individuals' connectedness with the community and the group of people who are under the influence of advocated issues. So when CEOs, they're addressing those controversial issues, many times we have to admit that many of the issues they're advocating are controversial. But then when they're talking about those issues, they can also highlight or underline the commonalities and the shared values we have. After all, we're all human beings, so we definitely would have more commonalities than disagreements, right? And by addressing the commonalities and by enhanced sense of relatedness and connectedness, we hope, this type of communication can actually, calming people down instead of fueling the already severe polarization that's happening in the political arguments. So that's another takeaway. And then lastly, for the other two types of psychological triggers that we have discussed here, which is autonomy and then competence. So they actually would work differently. So not every one of those two would be effective every time, and then whether they work or not, at least based on the current findings, it's highly related to the type of engagement objectives the CEO is interested in reaching. So it is also extremely important to so the third suggestion we have, it's important to know what its ultimate objective we're interested in, or CEOs are interested in, and then therefore look into what type of psychological needs they can trigger, they can kick off in order to reach those goals. Yeah, so that's the suggestion that we have.
That's really great. Thank you so much for providing all those helpful practical tips for the practitioners. And I want to thank you again, Grace, for chatting with me today. I really appreciate what you did. And to our viewers, thank you for tuning in. Take care, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, April, and
Bye,
thanks
Grace.
everyone. Bye.